And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Amundsen, Associate Professor of Geophysics, who will be introducing tonight's guest speaker. Thank you.
All right, so I'm happy to introduce Dr. Logan Berner, who many of you probably know. Logan is a graduate of the Environmental Science program here at UAS and has been kind of a poster child of our program. We're really excited about the sort of things that he's done. So I teach in the Environmental Science program. I started here in 2011, which was a few years after Logan graduated. So he and I actually hadn't met until tonight, but I'd heard his name many times from other faculty in the program. Ideally, somebody else would have been here to introduce him, but for various reasons, travel and sabbaticals and things, I was the last person standing in the program. So I started formulating an introduction for Logan, but then I decided it might be better just to get some input from other people that had worked with him when he was a student here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read some text that Sanjay Pyare sent to me. As I understand, Logan was Sanjay's first advisee when Sanjay started here at UAS, and so he has a long relationship with Logan. He wrote, Logan is originally from the community of Gustavus and Juneau. He was one of the first cohort students we shepherded through the Environmental Sciences program when I got here in 2005. Logan was a great student to work with, and even in our first few classes, all faculty in our program knew then that he would go on to do great things and be a great example of what's possible for students at UAS. It was easy to get him involved in a range of projects from amphibian biology and hydrology to remote sensing and glaciology. In fact, he was the first environmental science student that published from his UAS research. Logan went on to get his PhD in forest ecosystems and society at Oregon State University, worked as a researcher with the Woods Hole Research Center, including a stint working on the island of Hawaii, and then got a position at Northern Arizona University at the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems. In a lot of ways, his work very much still embodies the range of things he was exposed to at UAS, remote sensing and GIS, hydroclimatology, and forest ecology, and his publications are both high impact and profiled nationally. Logan and his partner Carly are now back living in Juneau after being gone for 15 years. Carly got a permanent position with NOAA as a whale biologist stationed here in town, and they're settling into a new life here in town and bought a house in the flats. Welcome home, Logan. So we're excited to have him back here in Juneau and to entrench him back into the UAS community and get him working on some research projects with us. And so with that, I'd like to ask him to come up. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's tremendous to be back at UAS, where my scientific career really began. And it's wonderful to get to spend this evening with such a great group of family and friends and colleagues and community members. It's really a special evening for me. In 2020, an exceptional heat wave rolled through northern Siberia. Temperatures reached 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit in a town that is best known for being one of the coldest inhabited places on our planet. This is the first time that temperatures over 100 degrees have been recorded within the Arctic Circle. Now, these exceptional temperatures were not just measured at weather stations around the region, but were also captured by NASA Earth-observing satellites. So this figure shows how anomalously warm temperatures were across the northern high latitudes during the spring of 2020, as compared to average conditions over the prior 2003 to 2018 time period. And so you can see in shades of, well, I guess to start with, we're up here. So we're going to see a bunch of maps this evening where we're kind of looking down on the Arctic from above. And sometimes they're a little bit disorienting, but you can oftentimes pick out the Aleutians and kind of track us back to Juneau. So you can see in the shades of oranges and reds where temperatures were anomalously high. We're talking 7 to over 14, 15 degrees Fahrenheit above average. This arrow points to the town of Verkhoyansk, which is the coldest inhabited place on our planet. And this is where temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit were recorded. This is an exceptional weather event that contributed to 2020 being the warmest summer on record in the Arctic. Now, satellite observations allow us to better understand not only the extent and impacts of extreme weather events, but also how the Arctic has changed more broadly over the last 50 to 70 years. So this evening, I'd like to start with a little tour of the Arctic, kind of a photo background and just general information, and then transition into a little bit of research focused on recent warming that has been evident across this domain. And then the bulk of the talk this evening is going to be focused on tundra ecosystems and how these ecosystems have responded to a warmer climate. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit of implications and conclusions about these dynamic changes that are occurring within the North. So the Arctic tundra is a cold, treeless biome that covers about 6% of Earth's land surface. This is an area that's so cold that only small shrubs, grasses, lichens, and mosses really dominate these northern lands. So you can see on the map the spatial extent of the Arctic tundra biome, in that it's broken up into these three broad bioclimatic zones. So we have the Oroarctic in red, the Low Arctic in orange, and the High Arctic in blue, in essence going from southern to northern extents. The Oroarctic is in essence what we find in the mountains behind Juneau. So these are the fingers of mountain ranges that come out of the polar Arctic and have alpine tundra, right? So this is a photo from Granite Creek Basin a couple weeks ago. And you can see these hill slopes that are covered with deciduous shrubs in the lower elevations, transitioning up into barren, rocky areas along the ridges. We also get the Oroarctic environment up in Finland, in Norway, and Sweden. And in this case, we have mountain birch woodlands that grade up into these barren fells. And these are the sorts of environments that support large populations of reindeer. Moving to the low Arctic, a little bit farther north, this is the zone that wraps around northern Alaska. We're talking the Brooks Range and the North Slope, wraps around Canada and large parts of Siberia. And in this area, you find extensive thickets of deciduous shrubs. So this photo from the North Slope, it's in the foothills of the Brooks Range, shows this landscape that's dominated by deciduous willows. In other areas, though, you have extensive wetlands and grasslands. So this photo from northeastern Siberia shows this riparian area dominated by grasses. And these are the kind of environments that support really large herbivores, Yakutian horses, or during the Pleistocene, large woolly mammoths, for example. If we transition even farther north, up into the high Arctic, so these are the areas shown in blue, this is the coldest, most northern reaches of the Arctic, where temperatures might rise above freezing for only a couple months at most out of the year. These are the areas that you find up in far northern Canada, up in the northernmost reaches of Siberia. And it's an area where you only really encounter really tiny shrubs, scattered grasses, and a lot of lichens and crust mosses. It's very inhospitable for plant life by and large. But it's also an area that, for example, geese flock to in the millions during summer. And so it's really important summer feeding grounds for migratory birds. Now, one thing that all of these different Arctic zones have in common is that they are underlain by cold permafrost soils. So permafrost is defined as ground that remains frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. These permafrost soils extend across the extent of the biome. You can see that shown in, purples on that screen. And these soils store a tremendous amount of organic carbon that is locked away in the frozen ice. So in essence, these soils are so cold that during the millennia, the low temperatures have inhibited microbial decomposition of the plant matter. And so those plants, instead of being broken down, the rooty material has stayed locked away in the ice. And that organic matter has built up over thousands of years, so that at this point in time, permafrost soils store over twice as much carbon as is currently found in the atmosphere. And so this makes it really important to understand what's happening in the north. How are these soils changing? What is happening to these huge carbon stocks that are locked away in frozen ground that is now thawing as temperatures rise and those microbes wake up and start decomposing this organic matter and releasing carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, up into the atmosphere. Now, it's also really important that we understand what's happening in the Arctic, because this is a zone that has a lot of unique cold-adapted plant and animal species. So reindeer, caribou, for example, have among the longest terrestrial migrations of any animal in the world. You know, these animals can assemble in herds of over 1 million individuals and are a crucial part of these Arctic ecosystems and also play a huge role in northern communities in terms of subsistence resources and the cultural value that caribou provide. And then lastly, the Arctic is really important because of all the people that live up there. You know, there's around 4 million people that live in the Arctic, including over 40 unique cultural groups. And tundra ecosystems provide invaluable resources, subsistence resources for these northern people, and also a lot of cultural and spiritual value for people in the north. So all of these factors make it really important that we understand the Arctic and how it's changing. So let's transition now to talking about recent changes in climate. It's getting hot here. All right. So this figure shows the long-term changes in Arctic average summer temperatures. So it's using an indicator called the Summer Warmth Index, which in essence is a metric that describes the total heat load coming into the Arctic each summer. And so for a recent study, we derived the Summer Warmth Index across the Arctic using each of 6 different global temperature data sets. So these are shown as the colored lines in that figure, and then the black line is the average across those 6 global temperature data sets. So these are data sets that are created by groups like NOAA, NASA, the UK government, and many other organizations. And in essence, what we find is that back in the 1880s, the average Arctic warmth was around 20 degrees Celsius. And then as of 2016, when this analysis stopped, temperatures had climbed to about 30 degrees Celsius, with especially rapid warming since the 1960s, maybe 1980s. You see this pronounced upward swoop in the last several decades, right? So this is a huge change in the amount of heat that is coming into the Arctic. Now we know that the Arctic has not warmed homogeneously, right? It's warmed to varying extents depending on where you are in the Arctic. So the map on the right shows the temperature trend from 1971 to 2021 in terms of mean annual temperatures. And the shades of oranges to reds, which dominate across the Arctic, are where we find rising temperatures, with the darker reds being the more rapid warming. And we see this exceptionally rapid rate of warming having occurred across northern Siberia, where we saw that heat wave roll through in 2020. Now, the primary reason that the Arctic is warming is because of carbon dioxide emissions from human activities. So back in the 1960s, measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii recorded measurements around 310 to 320 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, over the last 60 years, carbon dioxide concentrations have now climbed up to the point that they're bumping against 420 parts per million. And this primarily is due, about 2/3 of this increase in atmospheric carbon burden is due to burning fossil fuels. The other third is due to carbon emissions associated with land use and land cover change. So these are things that are like deforestation and converting carbon-rich ecosystems into agricultural areas. Now, these are the reasons that the Earth's climate is warming by and large. But one of the things that we found is that the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And the reason that it's warming so much quicker is that as the climate has warmed. There's been a long-term loss of sea ice. So the image on the left shows the extent of September sea ice in 1979, based on satellite remote sensing observations. And September is a time of year when kind of sea ice extent is tracked, because that tends to be the minimum extent of sea ice before it starts growing back up the following year. And so you can see that sea ice covered large parts of the Arctic Ocean back in 1979, but by September of 2020, that sea ice had diminished substantially. So there's been about a 12.7, 13% per decade decrease in September's sea ice extent from 1979 to 2021. And as that sea ice has declined, it's exposed more and more dark surface waters. And those dark surface waters absorb solar radiation that comes in, and instead of bouncing off the sea ice and reflecting back into space, it instead is taken up by the ocean, where it heats things up. And so the oceans don't warm by themselves, but rather that energy gets dissipated out into the broader Arctic and has contributed to such rapid rates of warming that we see in this domain. Now, it's not just air temperatures that are rising. We also find that permafrost soil temperatures are creeping up in most places where they've been monitored. So this is a time series graph of temperatures measured at 40 to 80 feet beneath Earth's surface at 15 long-term monitoring sites spread across interior Alaska and northern Alaska. And you can see that over the last 30 to 40 years, most of these long-term permafrost monitoring sites show a substantial increase in permafrost temperatures. Now, permafrost tends to not warm quite as quickly as the atmosphere. It's thermally buffered due to the overlying ecosystems. And so the temperature trends end up being a little bit more even, right? It's this gradual warming that we see manifested underground. It smooths out the year-to-year variations in weather and reflects kind of the underlying shifts in climate. Now, if we look over the coming century, what the latest generation of Earth system models project is that if we globally bring carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, that by the end of the century, we'll probably see about a 1.3 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperatures. In the Arctic, though, we're likely to see upwards of a 4 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperatures because of these amplifications of warming, including sea ice and other changes to the land surface. Now, on the other hand, that's probably a fairly optimistic assessment of what humans will do in the next 30 years. It's probably more likely that we go on the party train and double carbon emissions over the next 50 years. And if that's the case, then we're likely to see upwards of a 7 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperatures. Whereas in the Arctic, we're talking more of an 18 or potentially even substantially more. So the 18 degrees that we're seeing here is kind of the average across a big collection of climate models, right? So these are the best estimates of how the Arctic might change. But, some of those models might be more accurate than others. And so they actually predict a spread from 11 degrees upwards to 27 degrees. So we better hope that we're not actually living the 27 degree warming lifestyle when we think that we're living, an 18 degree lifestyle, which is also not great. But in any event, we'll likely see substantial warming, not only within the Earth's climate system overall, but especially within the Arctic over the course of the next half century. So let's get into some of the impacts that we've observed on Arctic ecosystems in over the last century. Now, one thing that has gotten a lot of attention has been the expansion of trees up out of the boreal forest into the Arctic tundra. So this is a photo of little white spruce saplings that I took a couple years ago in the northern foothills of the Brooks Range. So these little trees are probably 30 to 50 years old, and they are surrounded by nothing but Arctic tundra. These little trees made the hop out of the northern edge of the boreal forest, jumped over a mountain range, and are now living in an area where trees haven't been found for about 7,000 years. Now, what allowed us to find these trees was that colleagues at Alaska Pacific University had been looking at high-resolution satellite imagery from winter, and they had found these interesting little spiked shadows up on the snow surface. And what they realized was that each one of those little shadows is a tree. Now, you absolutely cannot see these trees in high-resolution satellite imagery from summer. They just disappear into the shrubs and other vegetation. But because of the snow cover on the ground, they were able to pick out the locations of something like 6,000 individual trees. And actually, quite fascinatingly, they were able to measure the length of all these tree shadows. They then went out into the field, measured how tall each one of the trees was, figured out how old it was, and they were able to do some statistics to be able to then estimate how old the tree was based on its shadow. And from that, they could reconstruct when the trees showed up in the watershed and how they spread across the landscape. It was really phenomenal. So this work was published in Nature earlier, just a couple months ago. Now, Roman Dial, who led the study and found all these little white spruce trees, was super excited. And it's a really exceptional finding that he made. But it's also not unique. It's something that has been observed more and more across the northern high latitudes. So the map on the right is from a recent synthesis study where researchers went through, they combed the scientific literature, found all the cases they could where people had looked at tree line dynamics in the boreal forest, at the edge of the boreal forest. And what they found was that of all the examples that they could come up with, over half of the documented reports showed evidence of tree line expansion. So these are all the green circles shown in the figure. There were a lot of areas that showed kind of stationary tree lines, but by and large, we find evidence for widespread invasion of Arctic tundra by trees. Another thing that has gotten a lot of research attention has been the expansion of deciduous shrubs across these northern lands. So this is a photo from 1948 that was taken by the USGS while they were looking for oil, I believe, up in the North Slope. And it shows this ribbon of alder coming down the hill slope. And a colleague of ours, Ken Tape at University of Alaska Fairbanks, he went back to the site about 50 years later, and he took this photo shown on the right. And you can see that now these alders have expanded substantially, not only within that drainage, but also throughout really the majority of the scene. Now, Ken didn't just go to one site. He went to something like 150 sites. And at many, many of these locations, he took repeat photos and found this evidence of shrub expansion. Now, satellites also provide evidence for widespread shrub expansion. Interestingly, back in the 1950s and 60s, the CIA had a spy satellite program called the Corona spy satellites. And so these were designed for looking at Russians, or people in the USSR at that point in time. And researchers realized in the last 5-10 years that these high-resolution satellite images are good for not only looking at Russians, but also good at looking at Russian landscapes. And so this figure is kind of grainy. It's from an undisclosed location in northern Siberia. It was from 1968. The black areas are alder shrublands. And our colleague got high-resolution satellite imagery then from 2003 and looked at the extent to which these alder patches had increased. Now, all the little red X's on both of those images show where there's been an increase in alder cover during this time period. Now, these researchers were able to get high-resolution imagery from the 50s and 60s from something like 10 locations across spanning Siberia. And at most of those locations, they found that indeed there had been this substantial increase in shrub cover in the last 30 to 40 years. Now, in a recent study, we went through, and kind of like the tree line people, we combed through the scientific literature systematically to find all the documented cases of shrub expansion in the Arctic. So this included examples like the two that I just showed you, but also a bunch of other ones where people had gone out into the field and measured attributes of shrubs over time, or where they'd looked at high-resolution satellite imagery or repeat photography. And shown in this figure, in the little blue dots, are areas where there's been a documented increase in some attribute of shrub cover, growth, biomass, or reproduction. And you can see that we find evidence for increasing shrubbiness of the Arctic quite broadly, not only in northern Alaska, being one of the places where it was first kind of scientifically documented, but also across substantial parts of Siberia, Canada, Greenland, Svalbard. It's really a pan-Arctic phenomenon. We do find areas where there hasn't really been any notable changes that we can detect in shrub attributes, as these are shown in the yellow dots. And then indeed, there are locations where there's been long-term declines in shrub characteristics, shown in red, or areas where there's mixed responses over time, or mixed changes over time. But by and large, the signal that we see is one of the Arctic becoming significantly shrubbier. Now, this expansion of trees and shrubs and a long-term increase in vegetation growth more broadly has led to a widespread greening of the Arctic that we can see from satellite observations that span this whole domain. Now, the tree line studies and these documented increases in shrub dynamics are invaluable, but inevitably they end up being for kind of point locations in a huge Arctic landscape, right? If you're a field ecologist, you can't study the entire Arctic. You go out to locations that you think are important, or that might be representative of the surrounding lands, and you try to use those locations to understand what's changing. But one of the beauties of satellite remote sensing is that we can look at the entire Arctic in a systematic manner and try to understand how it's changing. So the background coloration of this map shows the long-term change in vegetation greenness from 2000 to 2020, based on Landsat satellite observations. So in particular, it's showing the change in annual maximum vegetation greenness. So how absolutely green does the landscape get each summer? And then how has that changed in the last 20 years? So the shades of dark green are where we see upwards of a 7 to 8% increase in vegetation greenness over the last 2 decades. Now you might ask, well, how do we actually measure vegetation greenness using satellites? Well, I'm very glad that you asked that question, because in fact, one of the things we typically use is a metric called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. So NDVI works on the premise, so NDVI incorporates measurements of surface reflectance of solar radiation in the near-infrared and red wavelengths. So in essence, if you have a landscape that's covered with plants, it will absorb most of that incoming red radiation and use those red wavelengths to drive photosynthesis. On the other hand, if there's a lot of plants, it will reflect most of the near-infrared radiation. So just due to the physical structure and the water content of the leaves, it'll bounce most of that near-infrared radiation back into space. And so we can use those two spectral properties of the landscape that are measured by the satellites to derive this index that ranges between -1 and 1. Vegetated areas tend to have a positive NDVI value or greenness value. So this hill slope, for example, over here might have an NDVI of about 0.1. It's not very green, it's not very vegetated. This kind of grassy area down on the bottom left maybe has an NDVI of about 0.4. I just made up these numbers, but it's an educated guess. And then this dense alder thicket probably has an NDVI closer to 0.7. Now, it's easy enough to derive this index and to say it represents vegetation greenness. But how do we actually know that these metrics that we're seeing from the satellites tell us anything meaningful about Earth's surface and how it's changing? So one of the important things that our group has spent a lot of time doing is to try to validate these satellite remote sensing observations. And people have done this, for example, this is not our team, but they've shown, for example, that in if you go out and you measure the greenness of all the plants in a little meter by meter area, the greener that plot is, the higher the rate of photosynthesis that you tend to see on a per square meter basis, right? So we have a progressively greener landscape, and as it gets greener, we see this increase in vegetation photosynthesis arising as well. We also find that as these landscapes get greener, they also tend to have higher above ground biomass, or a total amount of live plants that are present on the landscape. So these are field measurements from about 30 locations across the North Slope of Alaska, where researchers went out and they meticulously clipped all the plants off of these quadrats. They brought the plants back to the lab, dried them out, and then our group pulled in satellite observations on top of these plants, and we found indeed that as the landscapes became greener, moving from like site to site, that they also had a substantial increase in above ground biomass. We also did a set of comparisons where we compared year-to-year variation in landscape greenness against rates of shrub growth from about 30 sites across the Arctic. So we had all these locations where colleagues had gone out and they had cut down alder and willow and birch, and they had sanded those little cookies and then meticulously measured the diameter of each one of those annual growth rings. And similarly, we generated time series of vegetation greenness for each one of these locations. And what we found was that overall, there's a pretty strong relationship between how green the landscape is in a given year and how much the shrubs grow in that year. So the map on the right shows all these locations where we looked at these relationships. And the color and size of each one of those dots shows the strength of the relationship in terms of the correlation coefficient, with a correlation of 1 being a perfect, like it falls on a 1-to-1 line. And so the oranges and reds show where there's a pretty good relationship. Greener years tend to also be more productive shrub growing years. So these kind of comparisons of satellite observations against field measurements help to give us confidence that what we're seeing in the satellite record really reflects underlying changes in the Arctic landscape. So if we go back to looking at this map, what we see if we just kind of ignore the dots for now and look at the background coloration is that we find evidence for a widespread increase in vegetation greenness throughout the Arctic over the last 20 years, as shown in this figure, but also over the last, since the 1980s, the last 40 years or so. We find widespread greening across not only northern Alaska and Canada, but substantially in eastern Canada, not so much in southern Greenland, where conditions have gotten hotter and drier, and there have been some big moth outbreaks and trampling by muskoxen. But we also find extensive greening across Fennoscandia and large swaths of Siberia. Now, if we look at kind of the prevalence of greening or stable vegetation across the landscape, that's what's shown in this figure. So the green colors are the areas that show, is like the fraction of each one of these Arctic zones, or the Arctic overall, shown in the panels on the far right, where there's been an increase in vegetation greenness. So by and large for the Arctic, we find that about 45% shows a statistically detectable increase in vegetation greenness, where about 50% of the landscape shows no systematic change over time. We find that greening is a little bit more common in the low Arctic than in the high Arctic, which is probably due to this extensive shrub cover and the sensitivity of shrub growth to climate. Now, if we take all these measurements of vegetation greenness from across the Arctic and we average them together each year and look at those through time, what we find is that there's been this systematic increase in Arctic-wide vegetation greenness, as shown in the figure on the right. So the black line shows the average Arctic greenness for each year from 1985 up to 2016. And you can see that there's been this long-term upward trend in vegetation greenness. We see it not only for the Arctic as a whole, but we see it also within each one of these individual Arctic zones, the high Arctic, the low Arctic, and the Oro-Arctic. One of the notable things that pops out in this time series is 1992, right? We see vegetation greenness kind of fell off a cliff in 1992. And what happened here was that there is a giant volcanic eruption in the Philippines in 1991 that spewed aerosols up into the atmosphere and caused the Arctic in 1992 to substantially cool. And when it cooled, it also led to a very cold, frigid growing season that wasn't conducive to plant growth. But by and large, we find this substantial greening of the Arctic over the last 4 decades. Now, this isn't a change that we just see in the Landsat satellite record, which are the results that I was showing in the last handful of slides, but we also see this more or less in all of the long-term satellite records that we have available to us. So the figure on the left shows the long-term change in vegetation greenness based on NOAA's advanced very high-resolution radiometers, the AVHRR satellites, which cover a time period from 1982 up to 2020. We similarly find evidence for really strong increases in vegetation greenness across the North Slope of Alaska and large parts of Canada and Siberia as well. The figure on the right shows similar widespread greening of the Arctic based on MODIS satellite observations. MODIS is a sensor that is, or it's actually 2 satellites that are run by NASA, and these provide observations globally from 2000 onward. So whether we look at changes based on the Landsat satellites, the NOAA satellites, the AVHR ones, or the MODIS satellites, we find evidence for substantial greening of the Arctic in recent decades. It's a very robust signal that is coming out of all of these different satellite records. Now we know that warmer summers tend to be greener. So this figure shows the average Arctic vegetation greenness on the y-axis, with higher, going up the y-axis being a greener Arctic in a given summer. And on the x-axis, we have the average summer warmth in the Arctic. Each one of these points is a year. The points are color-coded by the decade in which they occurred. And you can see that the 1980s and the 1990s in light blues and dark blues all kind of cluster down there in the bottom left of the graph. And as you step through the decades, each one is getting progressively warmer and it's getting progressively greener as well. We had a correlation about 0.74, which is a very high kind of statistical relationship between these 2 metrics, arguing that indeed these warmer conditions are benefiting plants substantially. But we know that warmer temperatures don't benefit plants everywhere in the Arctic. So this map shows the strength of the relationship between temperatures and greenness for each little grid cell in the Arctic. So areas that are painted in green depict where higher temperatures tend to be associated with greener summers. And you see that by and large, across the Arctic, most of the areas show this tendency such that warmer summers also tend to be greener summers. Now we know based on satellite observations, controlled experiments, ecological investigations in the field, that climate warming is really what is causing the Arctic to green. But there's a lot of kind of underlying complexity that contributes to this greening signal that we're seeing from the satellite record. So, for example, climate warming contributes to a earlier snowmelt in large parts of the Arctic. And this can affect how the timing of plant growth within the domain and how long of a growing season plants have. You know, if plants have a longer growing season, they might be able to put on more leaves and ultimately produce more plant matter over the course of that season. But we know that this doesn't happen everywhere uniformly within even a given landscape. And so how individuals' landscapes respond to this warming then kind of contributes to this patchwork of greening or stable landscapes that we see across the Arctic overall. We also find that climate warming, for example, is another causal pathway, contributes to this thawing permafrost. And as the permafrost thaws and warms up, more and more organic matter is broken down, and it liberates the nitrogen, phosphorus that has been locked up in those plants. And as those nutrients become available, it allows other plants to kind of move in and start taking up more of that nitrogen, which then can be a mechanism that allows those plants to grow larger, leafier canopies that we then see from the satellite record. And really, there's all sorts of different mechanisms at play, whether we're talking about kind of physiological responses of plants to warmer temperatures, population level demographic patterns of growth and death of individuals, competition among different plant types, and then kind of scaling out to the impacts of herbivores on these ecosystems. It ends up being a very complex set of mechanisms that contribute to where and why we see the greening of the Arctic occur. It's very difficult to look at an individual location in the Arctic and say, just based on the satellite record of vegetation greenness, why it's changed. But we know that there's a suite of underlying biological processes that are contributing to the patterns that we are detecting. Now, if we look at anticipated changes over the coming century, we can investigate these dynamics using ecosystem models. So these are mathematical models that try to incorporate a lot of plant physiology and ecosystem dynamics, some of which were shown in that last slide, to simulate how ecosystems work and how they might evolve over the coming century. And people have been exploring this realm of research for a long time. So like the Department of Energy has a huge research group focused on this. NASA has big research groups focused on this and supports a lot of university scientists to do this kind of work as well. And so the Department of Energy has done these simulations to model changes in vegetation productivity over the coming century using their ecosystem model. And that's what's shown here in the map on the left. So this is the change in shrub productivity from 2100 in comparison to 2010. So areas in blues are where there's a projected increase in shrub growth over the coming century due to warmer conditions. And by and large, we see that there's a projected huge increase in shrub productivity across this domain, with average shrub productivity projected to increase from something like 60 grams of carbon per square meter per year, upwards to now, or to something like 200 grams of carbon per square meter per year by the end of the century. So it's a 3-4-fold increase in shrub growth with continued warming over the next 80 years or so. Other people have tried to model this across the whole Arctic. So the figure on the right shows simulated changes in total live above ground biomass across the Arctic domain, where shades of progressively darker greens depict where there's expected to be the largest increases in total above ground biomass of live plants. And so these researchers estimated that there might be upwards of a 20 to 30% increase in the total matter of live plants within the Arctic over the coming, by the end of the 21st century, in essence. So we expect, we see based on long-term observations that there's all sorts of changes in Arctic vegetation already underway. And when we look at kind of state-of-the-art ecosystem model projections of the coming century, we find evidence that leads us to anticipate that these changes will continue over the coming years and decades as well. Now, of course, it's hard to know what comes into the future. A lot of that depends on what we as humans do in terms of the carbon emissions that end up living in the atmosphere. And it's also just in general difficult to know what's coming down the pipeline. but this is kind of the best available science that we have. So let's wrap it up with a little bit of implications about what some of this work means. So the Arctic greening that we see has really important wildlife implications. And one of the creatures that it's impacting has been moose. So moose graze or browse a lot on deciduous shrubs, willows especially. Willows, as we all know, oftentimes occur along streams and rivers and these kind of wet areas on the landscape. And these are some of the areas that have been most responsive to long-term warming, where we've seen an increase in shrub growth across large parts of northern Alaska. And so as these Arctic and subarctic regions have become shrubbier, it's allowed moose to creep out of the northern edge of the boreal forest and up farther into the Arctic tundra. So the map on the right shows the northern boundaries of moose going back to the 1880s for northern Alaska. And so you can see that back in the 1880s, they really were at the northern fringe of the boreal forest. By the 1920s, they'd creeped up, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then by the time we hit 2009, moose are suddenly showing up on the north slope. So moose have really benefited from these progressively shrubbier landscapes. But in contrast, wild caribou and reindeer are doing abysmal in the Arctic currently. So in the last 2 decades, wild caribou and reindeer populations have declined by about 56%, with some individual populations declining by over 90%. So the figure on the right, I appreciate, is really hard to read. I poached this out of NOAA's Arctic report card, and it shows the population size, the maximum population size in gray, and the current population size in black. And you can see that for almost every single caribou population in the Arctic, that they're significantly below the maximum population sizes that have been observed in prior decades, with some of them doing abysmally poor. And we know that there are some mechanisms that could lead Arctic greening to contribute to these long-term declines in caribou populations. So as these northern lands have become progressively shrubbier, the shrubs have outcompeted lichen. Now lichen, being little low-growing organisms, are really important wintertime food for caribou. And so as caribou have gone across these northern lands, they're finding less and less lichen each summer, or each winter in particular. So caribou tend to feed on lichen in winter in particular, and that's the coldest, harshest time of the year when these animals are just trying to eke out an existence. And so the long-term loss of lichen is one of the factors that could be contributing to the overall stress that these populations are facing. We also know that caribou and reindeer are trying to navigate a warmer and busier Arctic as well. There are more mines, there are more roads. There are these obstacles that are inhibiting caribou from moving freely across northern landscapes. Oftentimes when they hit a road, they'll just kind of turn and be unwilling to cross it. So there's this complex of factors that contribute to the long-term decline of these populations, but we think that the greening signal that we see from satellites and the underlying biological changes that it represents are one of the factors contributing to these long-term declines. Now, this long-term greening also has important climate implications. So as the Arctic has gotten greener and plants have been they've been growing more, and as they're growing, they're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they're locking that carbon dioxide away within the organic stems and leaves of the plants. And so that leads to this kind of drawdown of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere that could kind of slow the rates of warming because it reduces the atmospheric carbon burden. On the other hand, as these northern ecosystems have warmed, we're seeing huge amounts of permafrost thaw take place. And as that permafrost gets warmer and it thaws, like I've mentioned, a lot of that organic matter that's locked away within these permafrost soils starts to get emitted back up into the atmosphere. And currently, it's unclear to researchers whether kind of the increased carbon uptake by ecosystems, by plants, whether that'll outweigh the carbon emissions due to permafrost thaw over this coming century. And part of that is probably going to be due to how rapidly the Arctic warms over the coming century. So if the Arctic warms really rapidly, it's more likely that permafrost thaw will beat out increased plant growth, and that we'll see this overall pulse of carbon dioxide coming out of the Arctic and further contributing to the warming that we see, not only within the Arctic, but also globally. On the other hand, as these landscapes, as plants in these landscapes have moved across and begin to colonize areas that didn't have plants, it affects how these landscapes reflect solar radiation back into space. So in areas that have very few plants, a lot of the incoming solar radiation is bounced off the land surface back into space. On the other hand, when we have a lot of trees that move into these areas, it darkens the landscape and it leads to a lot more incoming radiation being absorbed. And as that radiation is absorbed, it causes the land to warm up. And so this warming from the surface reflectance, changes in surface reflectance, could further amplify the warming that we see, especially within the Arctic. That's more of a regional effect that we're likely to see in comparison to the warming associated with carbon dioxide emissions. And then lastly, these sorts of changes have a broad suite of societal implications. You know, caribou, reindeer, moose, these are important subsistence resources in northern communities. And so how these large herbivore populations change over time has strong impacts on food security for northern communities. You know, as these northern lands have become shrubbier, they've become more challenging to move across as well. Whether you're walking through a shrub patch instead of walking through a grassland, or trying to take a snowmobile, or a reindeer-drawn sleigh, as in this photo of the Nenets reindeer herders in western Siberia. Now, these impacts not only influence people who are living directly in the north, but also scale out to the global community more broadly. The climate feedbacks that we see coming out of the Arctic aren't just going to stay in the Arctic. These are going to be things that affect the global society more broadly. So overall, you know, we find that the Arctic is rapidly warming. It's warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. We see that trees and shrubs are benefiting, by and large, from these higher temperatures. They're growing faster, they're growing larger, they're expanding into areas that didn't have trees or shrubs in the past. And the landscape overall is becoming substantially greener. We can see this using all sorts of different long-term satellite records. These changes in vegetation end up having a suite of consequences then, whether we're talking about implications for climate, plants and animals in the north, or communities, both in the north and more broadly. And really, the signal that we see from these long-term satellite records is a bellwether of global climatic change. Points towards the ability of humans to fundamentally affect our planet and the fate of the planet as we move forward. So most of this work has been funded by NASA and the National Science Foundation. So I'd like to thank them for their support, and also, again, thank you all so much for coming out this evening. I guess if anyone has any questions, there is a mic.
Oh, there we go. Great, thank you for that great talk. I was wondering about basically about the MODIS sensor that's used for NDVI. I know that has pretty low spatial resolution, and I'm just wondering if there are other sensors that people are starting to use to look at greening at sort of maybe more like a basin scale instead of Arctic wide, and then relating that to things like slope and aspect and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of the long-term satellite records that we have of changes in vegetation greenness across the Arctic. So both the AVHRR satellites and the MODIS satellites, these are both very coarse spatial resolution. So for example, the advanced very high resolution radiometer, despite its very high resolution sounding name, actually has each pixel being about 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers, 6 miles by 6 miles, right? Which means that within an individual pixel, you can have all sorts of things happening, right? You could have permafrost thawing, you could have lakes flooding, you can have some areas with shrubs expanding and other areas with nothing. With the MODIS satellites, we get a spatial resolution of 250 meters to 500 meters. So it's already a step up, a huge step up in terms of spatial resolution in comparison to the AVHRR observations shown on the left. But still, there's a lot that can happen within each one of those individual grid cells. And so there's been a big push to try to investigate these long-term changes using higher spatial resolution satellite observations. And so that is one of the things that led us to do this Pan-Arctic study using the Landsat satellites. So that is those satellites provide 30 by 30 meter resolution grid cells. So it's about a 90 foot by 90 foot resolution. And while you still might have a decent amount of processes occurring within a grid cell like that, it's a huge step up in terms of our ability to resolve the landscape. And that study that I showed, this study was one of the reasons it was really exciting was it's the first time that we've ever used the Landsat satellites, or that Landsat satellites have ever been used at a Pan-Arctic scale to investigate this question. And so it was kind of a seminal paper that we did a couple years ago that got a lot of attention. It got featured in National Geographic, it got written up in Science. But it allows us then to kind of dig into these questions in a more nuanced manner to try to understand how elements within the landscape are changing, and not just how kind of landscapes that are fuzzy, squinting at them from 10,000 feet above, how they're changing. Yeah. Yeah.
Squeeze this to raise it up to your...
Okay. Yeah, so this is very interesting tonight to me. Earlier this year, I read a book called Tree Line, and it's the first time I realized that the forests, boreal forests, are moving north. And I'm thinking, is this the Earth defending itself against it? But from outer space, we see Earth and we say, oh, there's green, there's life, that's a good thing. But and they're talking about by middle of the century, human migration will be going north, So is there good news about all this, or is it just tracking what the Earth is doing, or predicting whether these lands are going to be habitable or not for humans?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of these lands are currently inhabited. A lot of the work that we do is trying to understand kind of how and why and where ecosystems have changed. And part of the reason that we do that is that we can then use those insights to help build and refine ecosystem models that allow us to predict how these northern lands and kind of lands, ecosystems globally, how they'll continue to change into the future. And that could be, looking at impacts of different kinds of forest harvest management scenarios, or the effects of climate change on ecosystems. These are tools that let us to better anticipate and manage natural ecosystems so we can make more informed decisions. You know, whether Arctic greening is good or bad really depends on the organism that you're talking about. You know, it's not uniformly benefiting everything, nor is it deleterious to everything. So I think it ends up being challenging to put a value judgment on these changes. But we do know that it is really a signal of the potential impact that humans have on the planet now. That our ability as humans, we've gotten to a point where we can really shape Earth's surface for better or for worse. And oftentimes it's not for the better. Yeah.
Could it be used for agriculture? I mean, like for more traditional, that might
We need
not.
you to use the mic for the online folks.
I'm very short. It's fine. So I'm just curious, I hear what you're saying, and I know it is not beneficial for everyone. There'll be winners and losers, but as greater swaths of area that is currently being used for agriculture, like large-scale agriculture, is going to become not as productive, is anyone looking into that for that region, for different kinds of?
Yeah, I think so. You know, as the Arctic gets warmer, it's becoming more conducive to plant growth at large, and that could be beneficial for, you know, gardens and crops to some extent, but also as the climate has warmed, we are getting more extreme weather events. You know, we're seeing exceptional heat waves and droughts and fires that are also rolling through the Arctic. And we're seeing the fundamental landscape melting and, you know, permafrost thawing and landscapes sloughing off. And so it also creates a lot of risk at the same time. So while there might be boons for agriculture in some areas, it could also be challenging to squeeze modern agriculture into the Arctic, in part because also the length of days are not changing. And so sunlight is ultimately a constraint on photosynthesis as well, irregardless of how warm it is.
Of course, it's getting greener in most places on your map, but I'm intrigued by the northern Siberia where there's this brown spot. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that we're keen to try to better understand as well. But that's an area that it has all of these low-lying wetlands, and what I think is happening is that there's been a lot of permafrost degradation, thaw, that has occurred within this area. And there's been an increase in surface water as a result. And that has contributed, I think, to this long-term browning that we're seeing in the region. Yeah, it's getting swamped out.
We have a question online.
Oh, yeah.
And so we have a comment from Kathy Connor, who says, "Great talk, Logan. So wonderful to have you back at UAS. Your research is really interesting and a bit scary, unless you are a Boreal moose."
Well, thank you, Kathy. I'm so glad that you could tune in and that you set me on the path of becoming a scientist.
Hi. So I would like to make a comment that the Inupiaq people have been taking care of their homelands for thousands of years and have adapted to their homelands all throughout the top of that's where they are. With commercialization of the Arctic, with the over-extraction of resources, do you foresee more mass extraction and the moving in of commercialization and corporations being a possibility?
Oh, definitely. Undoubtedly. That's I think, a growing concern of people living in the north, is that we're seeing more and more shipping traffic, for example, louder oceans as a result of shipping traffic that are affecting marine mammals and the ability of northern communities to access not only marine mammals, but also other fishing resources. We're seeing more mines come in. Definitely as the Arctic warms up, there's a mad race to extract the resources that are in the Arctic. I think the US is just starting to wake up to that, but Russia and China, I think, are already very positioned for that. Like if you look at, for example, like the number of icebreakers that Russia has in comparison to the US, like the US has something like 3 or 4 icebreakers, whereas Russia has 40 or something like that.
I would also like to say that I am confident in my statement that if territorial governments and the hegemonic powers of rising world powers did not strip the indigenous people of their sovereignty of their land, this would not be happening at such a rapid case.
Yeah, I think that's an astute observation. Yeah. Thank you for that observation.
Okay, Stephen Lowe says or asks, has volcano activity been subpar, par, or greater than long-term trends? Any chance for cooling via volcanoes?
I mean, I think there's always chance for cooling from volcanoes. You know, as we saw with that eruption in 1992, I think really hard to know when and where volcanoes will erupt and how those emissions might contribute to kind of slowing the rates of warming that we see in the Arctic. But I think it's unlikely, or at least we shouldn't bank on volcanic eruptions saving us from global warming.
Yes, thanks, Logan. Good to see you again. You talked a lot about macrobiology. I wonder, has the entomologist gotten into this? And see, we're talking about base of the pyramid down there and the insects. Has there been any studies that might interweave with this and have some effect on the greening?
Yeah, and that's something that I'm not as familiar with, but there definitely have been some studies. You know, people have observed that, changes in the occurrence of pest outbreaks, for example. So there have been really large outbreaks of defoliating moths, for instance, that have occurred in northern Finland. And those moths stripped off the leaves of the mountain birch in those systems and contributed to kind of this dieback of large shrubs in these northern alpine environments. That kind of stifled the greening that we otherwise likely would have seen. And similarly, in southwest Greenland, there's also been some large defoliating moth outbreaks that have similarly kind of slowed the rates of greening, or really contributed to this browning of the landscape in conjunction with warmer and drier conditions in particular. But it's a great observation that, insects are a fundamental base element of many of these food webs, and it's crucial to understand how the Arctic environmental change is affecting those populations. But I would have to leave that to an entomologist to say more.
Great talk, Logan. Really appreciate it. Just to follow up on the browning area, so what do we know about liquid water through the rest of the century with permafrost thawing and maybe draining some lakes? But we're going to have warmer temperatures, more evapotranspiration. What do we know about liquid water, and does it amplify the greening in this case?
Yeah. Well, you know, one thing that people have observed is that a lot of the Arctic rivers are discharging more water now than they have historically. There's been this kind of amplification of the hydraulic cycle in the Arctic. Looking at climate models, one thing that they suggest is that we'll potentially see wetter conditions arising, more rainfall coming into the Arctic over the coming century. And so that could, in some cases, be offset by higher temperatures, leading to more evaporation, but also might make more permafrost thaw occur because the rain carries a lot of energy with it. It's very warm, and that rain then seeps down into the permafrost soils and thaws, kind of releases that energy and thaws the soils. You know, as we see permafrost thaw occurring, it's leading to lake drainage in some areas, as suddenly the landscape breaks open and the lakes flush out into the rivers. But in other areas, it's you know, leading to water accumulation, and so it's challenging, I think, to say. And I'm also not a surface hydrologist to be able to comment a bit more fully on it. But I think we should expect large-scale hydrologic changes to accompany a lot of these dynamics that we're observing.
A really great presentation, very comprehensive. Often it seems like it's very difficult to get people in the rest of the world to care about what's going on in the Arctic. You had briefly mentioned some of the other impacts, that there are other impacts that Arctic warming is going to have on the rest of the world. Can you elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, you know, one of the things I think that's quite notable is that as the Arctic has warmed, we've seen changes in weather patterns manifesting. So, for example, Texas suddenly had a snowstorm and froze. And I think Ted Cruz said something about eating something if Texas ever froze. And lo and behold, it did. And, you know, part of that is associated with changes in weather patterns that are occurring within the Arctic, with the jet stream becoming more wavy. And as it becomes more wavy, if it's waving down, it allows pools of cold Arctic air to pour out of the north down into these southern latitudes. And so some of the extreme weather events that we're seeing in the United States and other parts of the world are linked back to these changes in Arctic weather patterns. You know, we also have potential for these amplifying climate feedbacks to arise out of the Arctic, you know, especially in terms of permafrost thaw. Like I mentioned, permafrost stores about twice as much carbon as is currently in the atmosphere. And we see that a lot of that permafrost is getting warmer, it's thawing deeper each year down into the soil, and that more and more carbon is coming out in the form of not only carbon dioxide, but also methane, methane being a much more potent greenhouse gas that tends to be produced in wet environments, in these wetlands, in these lakes. And those greenhouse gas emissions could really be something that fuels further warming that we see across the planet. And so those become really important to consider and account for when we think about international climate accords and countries coming together and trying to set limits on how much we're going to keep the Earth warming to, right? If we're trying to keep the planet from warming more than 2 degrees Celsius, then it's crucial that we know how much additional warming could come from permafrost thaw. Because if we don't account for that, then we might set ourselves as humans on track to hit 2 degrees Celsius, but then permafrost thaw throws another degree Celsius on top of that. And so it becomes crucial that we understand kind of these Arctic ecosystem processes to better inform kind of not only regional behaviors, but also international agreements aimed at mitigating climate change.
I was curious what the effect of fires are in this. We saw that dip that you said was due to a volcano. I think I remember when Mount St. Helens blew up, and Colorado was dark for weeks after that. But California and Colorado have been on fire for 5 years now. So I'm wondering if that has an effect and how it compares to a volcano, whether you see dips because of all the fires.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So as part of this analysis that we did in 2020, we looked at the role of fires in contributing to greening and browning trends that we were detecting in the satellite observations across the whole Arctic. And in essence, what we found was that although fires are becoming increasingly common in the Arctic, and we're seeing things like fires overwintering and suddenly, popping up the next spring, nevertheless, their footprint on the Arctic landscape is so small that it's not one of the dominant factors that's contributing to the pan-Arctic greening that we're seeing. But when fires do occur, there's this really interesting facilitative mechanism that they have where they can then lead to subsequent greening of the landscape. So as the Arctic gets warmer and shrubbier, there's more fuel that's available to burn. And there's also more likely that you're going to encounter kind of hot and dry conditions simultaneously, right? So to get fires, we need not only fuels, but we need hot and dry conditions and then a spark. And so up in the Arctic, that oftentimes comes from lightning. And we do see that there's more and more lightning occurring in the Arctic. Conditions are getting hotter and drier, and we're also getting more vegetation. And then as these factors come together, we are seeing more and more fires occur within the northern lands. And when they do occur, while they burn off some of that initial vegetation, they tend to also burn away the organic matter that kept the soils really cold, that insulating mat of mosses and dead leaves and whatnot. And when that stuff all burns away, it allows the permafrost to thaw even more underneath it. And that releases a bunch of nitrogen into the soil profile and can then spur additional plants. So in some of these areas that have had fire, they then turn into really dense shrub thickets that are much more productive and greener than they were before the fires occurred. So fires can be a mechanism that catalyzes these ecosystem changes, not only in the Arctic, but also in places like Colorado and California. But in those cases, it's fires catalyzing ecosystem changes from forest, sometimes now into grassland and shrubland environments, if conditions have become so hot and dry and trees maladapted to those conditions that they're not able to grow back after those fire events.
And we have a follow-up question online. Do models suggest a limit for long-term stable CO2 carrying capacity on Earth?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Okay, let me try to repeat it. Do the models suggest the limit for long-term stable CO2 carrying capacity on Earth?
I'm not sure. Sorry, can't answer that question. Might need a geologist or someone who has a little bit of a deeper time Earth system perspective than myself.
Oh, any more questions?
Well, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It was great to spend the evening with you all, and thanks for the wonderful questions and your attention and enthusiasm. Hope you have a great evening.